Okay, thanks for coming along tonight, folks. There are some of us here in the room at 47 Phillip Street, and some of our interstate and rural and regional members online on the Zoom, and they'll be asking questions in due course. So then we introduce our speaker. Is very well known, so I'll be brief. Dr. Rachael Kohn taught religious studies at universities in Canada, Britain and Australia, and was the producer and presenter of programs on religion for the ABC, probably most notably, trying to remember what it was.
The Spirit of Things.
The Spirit of Things. That's how notable it was. Which, of course, was very popular. And she's the author of The New Believers, Reimagining God and Curious Obsessions in the History of Science and Spirituality. And today, on the occasion of the publication of her most recent book, The Other Side of the Story, Essays on Jews, Christians, Cults, Women, Atheist and Artist, Rachael Kohn is going to talk to us on the topic of Messiahs, Atheist and Deep Green Religion. Rachael Kohn, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerard and Anne Henderson. It's great to be here. And welcome to you all and those who are zooming in. Messiahs appear when faith is dimmed, to inspire hope when the woes of the world seem to overwhelm and the old ways do not seem to work anymore. They are most in demand when we don't feel safe and we look to someone to make us feel strong. Today our world is in such a time, and it is therefore no surprise that strident beliefs rallying around unlikely figures have spread like a bushfire in what punters believe is a secular society that left religion behind. I wrote an earlier essay on this topic, which is included in my new book, The Other Side of the Story. It was called Faith in a Post-Secular Society, which is how I configured our world in 2005, when studies were being published on the spirituality of Generation X and Generation Y, now called the Millennials, and the no religion category was rising in the census. The predictions of a religion-free society that began in the 1960s did not eventuate. In fact, a massive growth of novel cults and New Age figures flourished because faith found new objects, new causes, new ideals. That reality, however, was not accepted by atheists who declared that secularism was an incontrovertible fact and the way of the future. They did notice the rise of fundamentalists. However, they were dismissed as merely a reaction to the proven fact of secularity. Yes, it was a circular argument. I argued then, as I will argue now, that the spiritual hankering of human beings is an ongoing process. It changes, it develops, it deepens. It also grows thin, waxes cold, and fades away like the morning dew, to quote an old song. It fastens to strange ideas, conspiracy theories, and strong figures, and it finds new life when hitched to fashionable new agendas. In other words, faith is precocious, flirtatious, and mesmerizing when it promises a new world. And sometimes it returns to the old books and traditions when the promised redemption of the new faith fails to materialize. We've seen that in the rise of the Russian Orthodox Church after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's not long past Easter, when the Christian world commemorated the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, whose messiahship is the foundation of the church. Yet it is worth remembering that the Christian Messiah has been subject to waves of interpretation, from reclusive mystic to radical Marxist, from crusader against infidels and heretics to pacifist and social justice campaigner. We've seen how the Russian patriarch Kirill has reinstalled Christ as the crusader against the Ukrainians when he presented the head of the Russian Guard with a precious icon. Despite the different interpretations, faith has some abiding features. It needs to identify its enemies, punish evildoers, and promise to save the righteous. I don't believe best-selling author Yuval Harari's prediction that as human beings we're evolving away from religion and toward a robotic existence. But if he is even half right, then the messianic figure may well have robotic features, just as he did in the 1951 film, The Day the Earth Stood Still. Made at the beginning of the Cold War, the Christ-like figure was a humanoid Martian accompanied by a robot. He came bearing a life or death message for the human race, which would prevent its annihilation through nuclear arms. I'd like to comment on some of the messianic movements that have taken root in our day and venture some reasons for their rise. Since December 2018, when I retired from 26 years of making about 1,700 programs on religion, the world has lurched into a new phase. We're into the third year of a pandemic that not only continues to morph, but has had an unprecedented effect on the world's economy and on our individual lives, with now an estimated 15 million dead. We face a belligerent China, the number 2 economy in the world, which not only unleashed the pandemic, but refused to take responsibility for it. And because our Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, called China to account, it has adopted wolf warrior tactics, blaming the West with outlandish stories of contaminated frozen chicken dinners and imposing punitive tariffs and blockades on Australian goods. Simultaneously, China is growing its war machine and rattling its armor, along with its heavily armed puppet state, North Korea, as China prepares to invade the democratic country of Taiwan. Its comrade in arms, Russia, is prosecuting a similar move and committing genocide in democratic Ukraine, Europe's second largest country. Despite Western countries' sanctions on Russia and assistance to the Ukraine, they fall short of stopping the war because of Russia's looming nuclear threat. International organizations such as UN, WHO, and NATO were slow and frustratingly limited in their responses to these multiple threats to the West's foundational values. Natural disasters in Australia, which are not new or unprecedented, have contributed a sense of urgency combined with economic and human suffering. At the top of this list is the belief that global warming, which is now relabeled climate change since some regions experience very severe winters, is going to bring the cataclysmic end of the planet, and as a result, we must reach zero emissions by 2050 at any cost. All this paints a world of gloom, where prophets of doom who proclaim the end of the world is nigh gain a huge following, most of it extremely critical of our society's history, institutions, and religion, but most of all, our government. Fierce critics of the powers that be are not new. They first appeared in ancient Israel with at least 17 prophets of the Hebrew Bible, Hosea, Amos, Micah, Jeremiah, Isaiah, to name a few, who predicted a bleak future if the prevailing order was not overturned. In their wake, the Messiah would come with his promise of salvation to his followers. The West has seen many such prophets, but in the 1960s, the most famous was Baptist pastor Martin Luther King Jr., who held the attention of the nation with his brilliant oratory and timely message to give up racial segregation. His assassination in 1968 opened the way for a host of others, mainly fired by Marxism, from Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, Cesar Chavez, Malcolm X, to Danny the Red over in France, who led the 1968 student protests. Their scathing denunciations of capitalism, neocolonialism, and the church were in stark contrast to Martin Luther King Jr.'s hopeful sermons and stirring vision of a better America. where people would unite under the seminal message of the Bible, that all people were created equal and in the image of God, and were judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. All this took place during the Vietnam War against communist takeover. But when the war finally came to an end in the mid-1970s, with hundreds of thousands dead, including nearly 60,000 Americans and 500 Australians, the Vietnam War seemed to have failed. In its wake, many students fell for Chairman Mao's propaganda to let 100 flowers bloom, ignorant of how millions of Chinese died as a result of Mao's so-called Great Leap Forward. Mao became a kind of red saint. Rather than politics and war, personal spiritual transformations and visions of utopia took hold, and that was my era on campus, where I witnessed a tidal wave of spiritual teachers, cults, sects, self-styled New Age miracle workers, Indian gurus, swamis and yogis, Buddhist monks and nuns from a variety of Asian sects and countries, all together offering a vast array of spiritual paths that would lead their followers out of the degraded, sullied, corrupt, wealthy world of the West into the pure, simple, love-filled communes, ashrams, and intentional communities. As if. It didn't actually work out that way. My articles on this phenomenon, which are reproduced in my book, examine the methods whereby cult leaders not only promoted themselves as enlightened beings with supernal powers, but attracted large numbers of followers who were keen to adopt a new way of looking at reality. And they included students, widows, professionals, public servants, young couples, all kinds. I also document how they were abused, exploited, defrauded, and in some cases murdered, and also how cults hounded, silenced, terrorized, and at times killed their critics and innocent civilians. But what is most surprising about this tale is that many, if not most, of these groups, which practice militant collectivism, had the support of a large number of the most prominent academics who were keen to rebadge the phenomenon as an expression of authentic faith. Academics who simply relabeled the cult's new religions even applauded the groups for providing so-called chaste and regimented lives to students who might otherwise have got involved in the drug scene of the 1970s. In a strange way, university academics set themselves up as quasi-prophets, preparing the ground for the new messiahs, while turning a blind eye to the absolute control they exercised over the lives of their followers. Here are just a few names of the hundreds of messiahs that I could just run off, but I haven't got the time. Sun Myung Moon of the Unification Church, the Moonies, Moses David Brandberg of the Children of God, David Koresh of the Branch Davidians, Shoko Asahara of Om Shinrikyo, L. Ron Hubbard of Scientology, Prabhat Ranjan Sakar of Ananda Marga, Sai Baba of Satya Sai Baba organization, and just to throw in a wild card, one of the latest messiahs, Amy Carlson, who was a reincarnation of Marilyn Monroe, Joan of Arc, and Jesus Christ. She sold magical colloidal elixirs on the web, but recently died. And of course, Jim Jones of People's Temple really set the scene for our awareness of the damage cults could do. He led more than 900, mainly Black Americans, to their deaths by a suicide ritual at gunpoint in the jungles of Guyana in 1978. Not all academics and the legal fraternity exonerated these self-proclaimed messiahs and God-men, but enough of them did breach the rules of impartial observation and conflict of interest. They blocked the publication of critical, refereed articles on these groups and significantly prevented government regulation, investigation, and prosecution of them, arguing that they were just part of the spiritual rebirth of the West. So what is their relevance today? When I see so-called secular movements headed by self-proclaimed experts using extreme language to promote patently irrational beliefs which brook no criticism and corral young people, world leaders, and some very wealthy individuals and aspiring local politicians with threats of dire destruction, then I see strong similarities to the kind of rhetoric and methods of intimidation that cults employ. Here's a quote from someone who's almost reached messianic status. "Apart from climate, almost nothing else matters." It would certainly appear so to Greta Thunberg, who made that public statement and whose protest strike speeches and Instagram posts predicting planetary doom as a result of climate change has marshaled a worldwide following, including some very wealthy enablers like Holmes Accord, who's funded a group of independent candidates in our election on the grounds that they have pronounced climate as the number one emergency and strenuously deny that they are a political party. So what are they? A religion seeking influence? Presumably, they're ready to adopt Thunberg's austere personal regime, which she outlined for the rank and file, including giving up air travel. The last requirement reportedly destroyed her mother's career as an opera singer and turned her parents' lives upside down. But they aren't the only ones. Greta's campaigns that are as far afield from her Swedish home as Bihar, India, resulted in her image being burned in effigy by farmers protesting in Delhi. Yet 3 Norwegian lawmakers and 2 Swedish parliamentarians nominated her for the Nobel Peace Prize. What is remarkable is that this privileged Swedish teenager, whose selective mutism allows her to adopt a vow of silence when she elects to, has become a kind of Joan of Arc symbol for millions of people who've come to believe her message that climate change is an all-or-nothing phenomenon. Their demands reflect what I would call deep green religion, where outlandish gestures and urgent time frames have truncated the thousands of years of human habitation on this planet into an emergency extinction movement, as if there were no other serious threats to our human existence. Let me divert for a moment to an earlier time, just over 20 years ago. Do you remember 1999? I do, because apart from reading the hysterical articles in the press about Y2K, which was set to cause a worldwide shutdown in our computer programs, I attended a conference on millennial movements at Boston University. Over the course of several days, theologians, historians, and sociologists discussed the history of apocalyptic thinking, conspiracy theories, and cult-like behaviors during the period just preceding the year 1000 and the year 2000. Out of it, I made a 10-part series called Millennial Dreams. As we all know, Y2K didn't happen, even though the founder and director of Millennial Studies at Boston University, Professor Richard Landis, was summoned to brief the White House on his well-publicized warnings. What really brought the world to a standstill occurred a year later. It seemed out of the blue. Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda attack on the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and the foiled but planned third target, the White House. Extremist Islam, not computer programming, unleashed horrendous tragedy in America and the world. But it actually had started long before then, with the truck bomb in the North Tower of the World Trade Center on February 26, 1993. A long and wearying anti-terrorist defensive and campaign followed 9/11, the focal point being Afghanistan, but also around the world as Western democracies attempted to thwart copycat terrorism. And it's still not over. We know that war and terrorism is a brutal, bloody business, and its success is not guaranteed, as we are witnessing today in Putin's genocidal war in Ukraine. There's no precise prediction for war's outcomes and no sure prevention of terrorism. In a word, you're likely to get killed, which is why prosecuting a war on climate change that claims to predict accurate outcomes is a lot more attractive. No one gets killed, and it's firmly believed to be entirely within our control. This naivete is something that the West particularly falls prey to because we are problem solvers, and the tendency to believe that we're at the center of everything translates into thinking we can also control everything. And it follows that when we don't, we must be to blame. The attack on the World Trade Center was a case in point where almost instantly a chorus of self-blame explained the Al-Qaeda attack. Such thinking purports to be driven by a moral conscience, but I think it is symptomatic of a solipsistic illusion where all solutions to life's trials are in our hands. So what are individual believers doing to prevent climate change? Well, they wear pre-owned clothing, eat organically grown vegetables, give up meat for veganism. Also, they install solar panels, even if they do end up in landfill within 25 years. Usually it does not involve giving up computers, iPads, or iPhones because they're used to recruit masses of people to the cause. Most of these goods, including solar panels, are produced in China, which is the largest emitter of CO2 in the world at 31%, compared to America's 13% and Australia's 1.3%, or actually 1.1%. Why did the Green Senator Jordan Steele John recently assert that China does not pose a threat to Australia? Perhaps the Greens cannot bear the thought of living without China's solar panels, smartphones, and computers. And yet the Greens also wish to end all coal and gas exports, which would not go down well in China, which has 1,110 coal-fired power stations on the mainland and growing, and many more in its client states. Deep green religion is not new. The German and Austrian blood and soil movements in the 1920s and 30s promoted earth spirituality, animism, nature religions, and veganism, while it poured scorn on the Bible and the church. Similar movements emerged in America in the 1970s and here in the 90s, when paganism, Wicca, and indigenous spirituality grew in popularity and was signaled by wearing natural fibers, indigenous clothing, and living in mud brick houses. Well, fashions come and go, and mud brick houses don't last, and they're hellish to build anyway. But the championing of indigenous practices and beliefs has soared, and it shows no signs of abating. Once again, academics were at the forefront, seeding romantic ideas of a pristine indigenous past. Some were writers penning fake memoirs. The Education of Little Tree was an American bestseller, even after the author, Forrest Carter, was exposed as lying about being a member of the Cherokee Native Americans. In the 1970s, Carlos Castaneda captured a whole generation with his so-called ethnographic accounts of a Yaqui Indian, Don Juan Matus, a man of knowledge. Castaneda's books became spiritual manuals in which he claimed that he had been declared a seer of unusual perception into another reality. People believed Castaneda's claim that the path to spiritual discovery was paved with indigenous traditions, peyote, and a host of other hallucinogens. The teachings of Don Juan and all Castaneda's subsequent books were promoted as authentic, when in fact they were fiction. A similar phenomenon has occurred in Australia with Bruce Pascoe's 2014 Dark Emu, which won the 2016 New South Wales Premier's Literary Prize. And Pascoe was bestowed the Australia Council's Lifetime Achievement in Literature Award in 2018. While different in its thrust from Castaneda's shamanistic tales, it is an equally ideologically driven effort to extol indigeneity at the expense of falsifying the historical record and claiming that Aborigines were farmers and not hunter-gatherers before the Europeans arrived. The Australia Council called it a monumental achievement, but as someone wryly remarked, we love comforting fictions more than we love the truth. And there are some very uncomfortable truths about Indigenous practice, which did not provide sufficient sustenance for its people and resulted in too many cruel deaths, especially of babies. But that is another well-documented story. Today, the nexus between indigeneity and deep green religion and the climate change movement is growing exponentially. It does not usually result in coherent positions, and sometimes it creates grassroots conflict. For example, when the climate change movement demands the de-investment in fossil fuels and the closing of coal mines, it runs counter to the interests of many Aboriginal groups in Australia who benefit financially from mining royalties and employment, as well as socially through the provision of infrastructure, healthcare, and education by the mining companies. Ted Nordhaus, the American co-founder of the Breakthrough Institute, is an eco-modernist who has stirred up the climate change movement with his seasoned view that apocalyptic thinking about environmental catastrophe is not helpful because it distracts from ways in which humans need to adapt their infrastructure and habits to living with changed temperatures and conditions. For example, many Californian urbanites like himself moved north to be among the tall trees. However, it is a fire hazard area and also prone to earthquakes, and always has been. Nordhaus recommends spending more on burying power lines that have caused and exacerbated fires, planting drought-resistant crops, improving roads for easy ingress and egress. He says big emissions reductions will not change the conditions anytime soon, and as he knows, fires alone, not to mention earthquakes and volcanoes, create a pollution on a scale that exceeds a bad day in Beijing. So, the challenges of climate, whether it's hotter or colder, drier or wetter, should be focused on alleviating and adapting to its inevitable consequences, particularly as populations grow, and as long as they grow, it will be a problem. This is what humans have always done. The Dutch built their dikes, the Judeans built their cisterns in the deserts of ancient Israel, the Romans built their aqueducts over long distances and difficult terrain, and the engineering requirements of those environments were met with ingenuity, technology, and most of all, the imagination of Western civilization. But the deep green religion that has gripped our current world sees itself primarily as a spiritual and social justice movement, which also includes, by the way, other popular critiques, such as the anti-Israel BDS movement and the peace and disarmament movement that you may recall the Soviet Union so generously funded through so-called peace groups from the 1950s onward. Eerily similar, we now see that Australia's Greens are taking positions that align with Communist China's aims, declaring that they pose no threat to Australia. To summarize, I see the dangers of deep green religion as, first and foremost, it poses as a scientifically based movement that aims to occupy the seats of power in government, yet It relies on stoking irrational fears, extreme language, and naive policies that appeal to desires for a pristine existence that leaves no human footprint on the environment. Second, it ignores the real and present dangers to our lives in the immediate short term, which owe nothing to the predicted 1.5 degree rise in temperatures. Third, it leaves us unprepared to meet those dangers, whether they are wild weather events, economic hardship, or international warfare. Fourth, by demanding the massive defunding of Australia's natural resource-based economy, deep green religion is willing to throw a robust economy under the bus, where the standard of living and strong tax base funds our healthcare, our education, our research, and, among other things, our defense capabilities. Of course, defense is not important to deep green religion, which advocates demilitarization, that is, the dismantling of our defense force. Deep green religion denies the necessity of human warfare, unpleasant as it is, and also buries the historic achievements of European civilization and its religious traditions by imposing mandatory formulas which all but erase them from the public square. Nothing could be more heinous to the deep green spiritual universe, for example, than acknowledging the brilliance of James Cook, the eternal truths of the Bible, and the cultural riches that Europeans brought to Australia. All three are foundation stones to Australian society, yet every public event begins with an infallible dogma that invokes Indigenous elders, past, present, and future, as if they alone form the foundation of our society, our beliefs, and our civilization. I don't wish to silence Aboriginal people or erase their culture, but neither should we silence and erase what has built up this nation into one of the finest and most successful in the world. I would like to end by referring to the former member of the Northern Territory Legislative Assembly for Stuart, Bess Nungieri Price. I interviewed Bess and her husband Dave in their home in Alice Springs. Bess, after recounting to me how many deaths and murders and suicides had occurred in her family, in that year, said to me, Aboriginal culture and beliefs are not some Disneyland paradise the way outsiders like to imagine it. Her daughter, Jacinta Nampijinpa Price, an advocate of Aboriginal reform, who was my guest on the very last Spirit of Things, agrees. But we prefer comforting fictions to uncomfortable truths. I hope my remarks have whetted your appetite for some of the other religious controversies that I address in my book, The Other Side of the Story, and now I would like to invite questions.
You're talking about secularism and you're talking about religion. How do you define secularism? Is it a religion or is it an ideology? Because it says it's not a religion, but it's got a lot of formats like religion. So what is secularism as you see it? Talk as you were before, just to the end.
Okay. Well, I didn't actually use the term secularism. I used atheism. And we can talk about a secular society, of course, and that's when a variety of public institutions are based on secular principles. These secular principles have actually often been drawn from the biblical tradition that gave us the covenant and the concept of a set of laws and responsibilities toward society and toward each other. They have evolved in the late 19th and 20th century into, you could say, religion-free laws. And so when we talk about a secular society that are governed by those things, That's one thing. However, when you have an ideology, say when atheists wish to prosecute their particular perspective and remove religion from most aspects of life, even public life and education, then you've got something else going on. You've got an anti-religious movement. And when people speak of secularism, they're usually talking about a kind of ideological uptake of the secular, which is anti-religious, whereas a secular society is not in itself anti-religious. It usually permits and allows the observance of religion in a variety of ways, both personally and publicly and through education. So that's how I would respond to that.
Okay, so we come to questions and discussion. There's a question there.
Thanks. Thank you, Rachel. Slightly off the topic, with global warming and all its controversy, why is it that we never hear that the current population of the world is 7.5 billion? I'm not sure what the projections are. I'm sure Gerard knows. I'm not sure what the projections of the world population will be in the next 5, 10, 15 years. But with global warming, by definition, if we accept it, and probably there's some reasons to it, population density must manifestly influence it. Now, this is completely the elephant in the room, and I've never heard the Greta Thunbergs or indeed anyone mention the fact that...
Okay.
I think that you have just pointed out that population density is a big driver of warming and of changes in the climate, obviously of industrialization. And we see that in a country like China that has well over 1 billion people and 1,110 coal-fired power stations. And so naturally there you've got an intensity of pollution and what one would expect, particles in the air having an effect on the climate. I think, the whole population question is tricky because how do you reduce population? Well, we've had a COVID pandemic that has, given it a bit of a wallop. And if 15 million people have died, as people estimate, then we've had a bit of a drop down in worldwide population. But in the end, I think that, yes, population and people will obviously have a great effect on the environment. But, my concern would be, if we're talking environment, my concern would be less about global warming and more about straight pollution. There's a great deal of pollution that, for example, plastics in the ocean, that has got to be one of the worst things, and spills, oil spills, and things like that, which have been really pushed to the sidelines. People are not talking specifics. Back in the 60s, when Pollution Silent Spring was published, we were all, and Lake Erie, in my part of the world, in Canada, Lake Erie's in the States, but we share half of it, was highly polluted. Everyone was concerned about pollution, and I think pollution really definitely is a problem. And it also appears not just in industrialized societies, but one can see in developing societies where garbage and refuse is simply not properly treated or used or controlled.
That was great talk. Thanks, Rachel. The talk about the various messiahs and messianic cults that they appear, some of them crash and burn, suicides, self-destruct, but some of them go mainstream, whether it be Jesus Christ or Muhammad. When we talk about global warming and the attitude of people towards climate change, I'm interested to consider, is this now mainstream, or is it likely to crash and burn? My own inclination, I'm getting to the question, Gerard, I know, is that there's now so much pressure amongst the corporate world and amongst the institutions who own the companies that there's massive pressure on all companies to go green, and those that don't go green are finding it harder and harder now to raise money. Their cost of capital is going up.
Yes.
So I think we may be at that tipping point where it's gone mainstream, but what do you think?
Well, I think what you've just described, Nick, is very much the reality now, and that is that a few very, very loud voices, very much supported by academia, are driving the larger producers, of course, and the economy. Whether this will crash and burn, I think that we might get burned. I think that economies will discover that they can't be running after chimeras that are half-proven, such as hydrogen fuel and such like. And yet those sorts of ideas grip young people. They grip all sorts of grassroots organizations, and suddenly they become wildly supported by people who actually don't know very much about the ideas behind these so-called, breakthrough developments. The messianic phenomenon in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s was huge. And many, many, many of those groups continue today. They run businesses. They still behave in ways that are against the law. There are still people who disappear. And the fact is that today there's not very much interest in following what's going on with those groups, as there was earlier on. But whether the deep green religion will crash and burn, my greatest concern is that it will take too many of us with it when it does crash.
There's a question.
Rachel, I really enjoyed your talk very much, and I think you've really analysed a lot of the things that are the deepest concern to our children and will be to our grandchildren to come. It's going to take a long time to overcome this. But when you talk about deep green, there's a deep green institution that is a favourite subject of our host tonight, and it's the ABC and the absence of any significant conservative voice, producer, editor there. With all of your experience at the ABC, I'd be very interested to know what can be done about curing what seems to me to be an infection that has prevented the ABC's management and its board for making sure the charter standards that I understand are their responsibility to comply with get complied with.
Okay.
That's the $64,000 question, and it is a very serious one and one that always concerned me, particularly when Gerard said there were no conservative presenters or producers in the ABC, and there I was, always a conservative, and yet under the radar because I was addressing subjects that were not of interest to mainstream journalists, i.e. religion. I do think that the ABC has a serious problem with its left-leaning reportage. One can hear it almost every night, how stories are positioned, what sort of duration of time is given to a Labour, a pro-left grab, and how critically, if a liberal story is reported on, it's inevitably extremely critical of it from a left-wing perspective. The ABC always argued that it was critical of labor, but it always, usually was, critical of labor from a further left position, and it was usually critical of, say, right labor. But I think the problem is much broader, and it is a journalist culture which tends toward the left, and also the way in which journalists are trained. I think these days journalist courses are trained by ex-journalists themselves, and so you get a sort of circular economy, as it were, a circle of ideas that people never break out of. In my opinion, the reason why I was able to maintain I think, an integrity of approach to the subject of religion, which of course is often driven by left and right ideologies, was because I was trained as an academic, and my approach to the study of religion, the analysis of it, was from a much less ideologically tainted position. And that also says something about my age, too. I think back in the time that I was in graduate school and in religious studies, it was perhaps less ideologically driven then than it is now in Australia.
Well, on the topic of the ABC, tell us about one of your colleagues, Dr. Carl. You know Dr. Carl. He's a bright guy, right? And well-educated scientist, I think, is he? Yeah. No, there's a story about a profile of him in the Week in Australian magazine about 2 weeks ago.
That's right.
And he tells the story how about 30 or 40 years ago, his mates convinced him the world was ending.
Right.
So he took a few peanuts and a couple of bags of soap and a cushion or something up to the Blue Mountains to escape it. And then he found it didn't happen. Another guy, the late Bob Ellis, he thought that the Soviet Union would drop bombs on Sydney, so he went to the Blue Mountains, because if they'd tried to drop bombs on Sydney, they probably would have dropped them on the Blue Mountains and they would have got him any rate. So why do people believe what they want to believe?
Yes. Well, in my opinion, it usually has to do with the cohort you are hanging out with. People are, in a sense, herd animals, and they do adopt the views of those they hang out with, sometimes reluctantly. And this is very much the case these days with students on campus who find that certain points of view that they see are natural and necessary to question will get you into trouble, will alienate you very, very quickly. And consequently, it is typical, and it's also the case with young journalists who come into a large organization. Very quickly, they know what is the favored position, what is the favored program, who is going to endorse them if they take a particular perspective on a story. This is the oldest kind of human adaptation in the book, and it probably happens even among animals who want to adapt and survive and stay safe, so they adopt the views of those who they perceive are more powerful. One of the problems I have, though, with the university is that it is meant to engender a sort of intellectual courage, and instead it often just imposes intellectual conformity and punishes intellectual courage. And I think we need to say a whole lot more of that in our universities, in our journalist empires. We need to have people who are well educated and who have enough assurance in their research and in their experience to be able to question things and not be punished by it. But unfortunately, Gerard, as you know, most journalist institutions have a particular position that they defend, and it's often quite difficult to break out of those.
Thanks, Rachel. That's more than food for thought. I want to go back maybe to the traditional religion side of things. I mean, the big green religion could well be a fizzer, because we've seen what's happened with the Ukrainian-Russian gas crisis. Suddenly the targets are no longer so important, and coal mines can be reopened in Britain and whatever. So it could be another fad. But what is the characteristic of those religions that have endured, real religions in the sense of belief in a deity, such as Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, and all the rest? What is it about them? Is it that they structure an institution around them, or is it that they give people something that takes them forward rather than gives them a paranoia about death?
Gosh, and that's a multi-layered and brilliant question about what are the features of traditions that keep going. And yes, there is a hope, a positivity, also practical elements that allow you to survive and thrive in society. And one of them is a freedom and an ease to question. It's very important. You know, one of the typical arguments pro-cults in the 70s was, they're just like the Catholic Church, or they're just like, any other church or religion. But that's actually not the case. A cult, you walk in the front door, you can't leave. You're climbing out the window at night, possibly. You may drop to your death. It's not easy to leave a cult. You go in the front door of a church or a synagogue, and what you're going to see there are people with diverse views. You're not going to all think alike. You'll go to the people who think like you, and maybe you'll leave for 5 years and say, I'm out of here, this doesn't satisfy me anymore. Nobody is going to run after you, text you mean texts at night, stand around your door, in vigilance, shadowing you, as is typical of cults, as is typical of ideological groups that are desperate to be supported and therefore cannot take criticism. The great thing about established traditions is that they do take criticism. They take it all the time, left, right, and center. Some of them need it more than others, that's for sure. And some of them can behave cult-like. And there are certainly churches that do behave cult-like. There are church-based cults, actually, in Australia who purport to be churches. They're usually independent churches, but they're actually behaving, have all of the characteristics of a militant lifestyle that is highly punitive and that does not brook controversy or question. And when I talk about deep green religion, cult-like behavior, the problem is when it does not allow critical analysis. It will never say, we were wrong about that. Maybe we should change a bit, which is one of the reasons why the fellow Norhaus, who I mentioned, really suffered in the environmental movement, because he was a champion of it until he started to look more closely at it and became slightly critical. Still a champion of environmentalism, but with a more nuanced look at it, and that is what we need. We're educated enough to be able to do that.
One question off the back. Yes. That'll be quick.
Thank you very much. The 2,500 years ago, like Plato in his late work, The Law, and he presented a problem which is he cannot solve, which is he said, it's very easy to train an ordinary person to become an athlete or war general, but all you have to give him just a lot of training and mental education. But he said when that person became elite or a general, and there's nothing you exercise or training you can prevent him to corrupt himself, to get drunk, to go to parties. So I'm wondering,
Gotta be brief.
Yes, yeah. I mean, what prevent human being to be more spiritual? Is that a material pursuit, or Otherwise, I thought it's the opposite always. When you become very comfortable, very wealthy, you start to lose your spiritual life. Thank you.
So what prevents an individual from becoming more spiritual? And if they become
Yes.
more wealthy, do they lose their spirituality?
That's a very interesting question, and I think very, very pertinent, because it's materialism and the addiction to material wealth which has caused the greatest gap within the human soul toward a religious or spiritual life. That is, toward values that require sacrifice, that require patience, that require vigilance and charity and forgiveness, and those sorts of things. Those sorts of qualities do not come easy. They are learnt, and often through adversity. That's why the comfortable life often inures us to those lessons. And it is a serious problem, I think, that the affluentia in this country and in the West have. They're wondering why their kids are not exhibiting more spiritual values. And what are they doing? They're hanging on to climate change. That's the only word they know. And they think it's got to be great because it's moral, and people say it has something to do with guaranteeing the future. So, wow, it's got to be good. But, they're not really very deeply aware of most of the issues that assail us as human beings in this world. And a 1.5 degree rise in temperature is not the most important one.
Many thanks. Well, many thanks to Rachael Kohn. I've always been a great Nan and I've always been a great admirer of Rachael, because apart from being a very good speaker and a presenter of ideas, she's a great scholar, and this book is just replete with scholarship, and so congratulations. Now, we've got some copies of the book tonight. We're right on time. We always finish right on time, and Anne and myself and our dog Jackie are about to head off to the Blue Mountains, just in case something happens down here. And the last train's about to leave, so there we go. Provided nothing happens at the Blue Mountains, we'll be back here next time. Well done. Thank you.